All right. Hello and welcome everyone. Now, in our previous lecture under the Delhi Sultanate, we had talked about their land revenue administration, and with that, जितना भी political history का evolution है, that we have already covered. Now, we need to talk about the historical chronicles or sources of the Delhi Sultanate. Now, with the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, a new type of historical literature emerged for the first time in Indian history. This is known as Tawarikh literature. The word Tawarikh is a Persian word which literally means history. Okay? Now, this Tawarikh literature consisted of a systematic chronological record of all important political events and administrative policies introduced by various sultans of Delhi over time. They were written by official court historians working under royal patronage. The bulk of these writings are in the Persian language, which was also the official language of the Delhi Sultanate. Not only are they a raw mentioning of important details, they also consist of the analysis of these policies and decisions, why they took place, what was their impact. So they are also analytical works. In most cases, these authors were describing what they were witnessing first hand. So many of them are also considered to be primary sources. But at the same time, the court historians of the various sultans also had contact with their own past. Okay? So they were relying upon previous histories for recreating those bygone ages. Okay? So not only were they purely primary sources, but they also referred to the past through the lens of previous historians. So they were also quite reliable secondary sources. And the Tawarikh genre of literature borrows heavily from the Islamic tradition. So it was definitely in association with Islam that this kind of literature was introduced in India in a systematic manner for the first time under the Sultanate. So it represents a continuation of the Islamic tradition of West and Central Asia. Some of the important tawarikhs of Indian history, बताओ कौन कौन से? the Kitabul Hind, written by Al-Biruni, the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri, written by Minhaj-u-Siraj Juzjani, the Tarikh-e-Firuz Shahi, written by Ziauddin Barni, the Tarikh-e-Firuz Shahi, written by Minhaj-u-Siraj Afif, and the Tarikh-e-Mubarak Shahi, written by Yahya bin Sarhindi. ठीक है. हाँ, तारीख-ए-फिरोज शाही was initiated by Barni, completed by Afif. तो ये जो अफीफ की राइटिंग्स हैं, they are considered to be a sequel of Barni's writings. Similarly, Barni's Tarikh-e-Firuz Shahi itself is considered to be a continuation of the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri. ठीक है. तो ये कुछ इंपॉर्टेंट तवारीख टेक्स्ट्स हैं which are relevant for the Sultanate period and the pre-Sultanate period. तो किताबुल हिंद जो है that was in the pre-Sultanate period. Al-Biruni was a contemporary of Mahmud of Ghazni, उसके साथ. ठीक है. Now question arises, what were the factors behind the emergence of this genre of literature? क्या factors थे? First of all, under Islam, a new intellectual tradition emerged in which emphasis was placed upon recounting important events which shaped political, social or economic history. तो under early Islam इस तरह की डिटेल्स को जानना जरूरी माना जाता था. In other words, that is what it is. Secondly, once again under Islam, recording the deeds and achievements of the Prophet and the caliph were considered to be acts of religious merit. जैसे कि हज परफॉर्म करना एक पुण्य कमाने का रास्ता होता था, वैसे ही फॉर द स्कॉलर्स it was a way to attain religious merit, to earn religious merit by recording the deeds and achievements of the prophet and the caliph. तो वहां से एक हिस्ट्री राइटिंग का ट्रेडिशन शुरू हुआ. Thirdly, with the expansion of the Islamic Caliphate, not only did it emerge as an important political power across the world, it also emerged as an important cultural power. With the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate across Asia and Africa, across Central Asia and Africa, the golden age of Islam began around the 8th century. And in its effort to establish itself as a cultural power, the caliphs began to patronize all varieties of artists and scholars. Therefore, history writing, which already enjoyed so much importance under the auspices of Islam, was promoted in an unprecedented manner. Okay? So, resulting from the prosperity and the Islamic heritage, it is not surprising that history writing received generous patronage. ठीक है? Fourthly, with the emergence of the institution of Sultan, it was important for these dynastic rulers to etch their name into the legends of history, right? And what is the best way of doing that? By patronizing history writing, which is going to be generous towards them. The sultans also began to patronize history in a major way. In this, the earliest task was undertaken by Mahmud of Ghazni, who commissioned famous scholars such as Firdausi and Al-Biruni to write glorious and favorable accounts of his reign. Firdausi wrote the Shahnama, which is considered to be the earliest work of proper systematic Persian poetry. So it is considered to be a pioneering work of Persian literature, and it set the template and the tone for future chronicles about various sultans. It was heavily, or you can say it heavily showed Mahmud of Ghazni in a positive light, and that was the same tone that was inherited by the successor writers, by the future writers when talking about their patrons. Similarly, the Kitabul Hind, although it does not talk about Mahmud of Ghazni directly, it introduced the tradition of scientific writing of history to India for the first time. And with the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, the sultans continued the existing intellectual tradition. They inherited a well established tradition of history writing in the form of Tawarikh literature. The Sultanate was further aided in its quest to systematize history by events that were taking place in Central and Western Asia, such as the Mongol invasions, which drove a large number of Islamic scholars from Persia and the Arabic region towards India. So there was a huge influx of scholars. Thirdly, by this point of time, the patronage of culture had become one of the important symbols of sovereignty. So a king would not be considered to be a real proper king until and unless he gave a lot of importance to architecture, art, promotion of literature, promotion of literary studies, promotion of poets, promotion of artists of various varieties, promotion of religious studies, etc. Right? And therefore, the Sultanate's patronage towards historians could also be seen through the lens of gaining political legitimacy. Since heavily patronizing scholars was considered to be the duty of a sultan. Okay. One other way in which they were seeking political legitimacy was by having these scholars patronized by them, writing glowing accounts about their rule. Okay. So they also used this Tawarikh literature as a propaganda tool through which they sought not only to ensure their place in history but also the continuation of their dynasties in a very, very tumultuous period, in a very unstable period. Okay? So these are the factors behind the emergence of Tawarikh literature as an important genre of history. Now, their limitations. सबसे पहले strengths देख लेते हैं. Their strengths. तो बताओ, what were the advantages of this new type of literature over the existing type of literature in India? with respect to the study of history? How were they better suited for the reconstruction of history? Write down या फिर सुन लो. Unlike the existing Indian texts, there was no muddling of historical fact with myth. They were purely factual. यहाँ पे mythology को incorporate नहीं किया जा रहा था, right? Secondly, in comparison to the early existing Indian texts, the authors of these Tawariq literatures paid proper attention to chronology, which was well established. Thirdly, the authorship of Tawariq literature is also much more reliable. Almost every book is assigned to a particular author. We know the period during which they lived. We know the names of their patrons. We know the full list of their works. So they are presenting a more reliable picture into the minds of the author, what their motivations were. In comparison to the early Indian texts, many of them जिन पे कोई author का नाम नहीं होता था या फिर नाम भी होता था तो it was largely fictional. These were much more reliable. Fourthly, जो Indian intellectual tradition था was history writing, the writing of pure history, given a lot of importance या फिर वो lesser importance का होता था. It may have been important, but its importance was marginal. Mainly the Indian tradition focused upon religious works. ठीक है? Unlike those works, ये जो तवारीख literature है, they were works of pure history. Right? Now, while the earlier Indian works may have mentioned some historical event, any mention of those events was tangential. उसके ऊपर main focus नहीं होता था. So, did the authors of those early Indian works give a lot of attention to explaining the factors behind those events or the impacts of those events? नहीं करते थे. वो analysis नहीं देते थे. In contrast, the Tawariq literature was deeply analytical in nature. Sixthly, the earlier works वहां पे प्रायोरिटी किसके ऊपर होता था? ऑन ट्रांसपेरेंसी और opacity. That means, did they want the readers to learn about the complete truth या फिर did they want to shroud the reader's mind in a sort of mysticism? Mysticism, right? तो एक पर्दा लगा के चलना चाहते थे, मिस्टीक बना के रखना चाहते थे, राइट. दिस इज इन कॉन्ट्रास्ट टू द तवारीख ट्रेडिशन, वेयर देयर वाज ग्रेट एम्फेसिस अपॉन transparency and clarity. Now, does this mean that the Tawarikh literature was completely reliable? इसके ऊपर आंख बंद करके भरोसा किया जा सकता है या नहीं कि जो लिखा है 100% सच है? नहीं किया जा सकता है. एंड thus we come to the limitations. Now, earlier colonial historians में एक perception emerge हुआ that these works are irrefutable, कि इनको uncritically आप absorb कर सकते हैं and you can rely upon them 100%. However, these texts were later found to have some serious limitations. Firstly, the question of patronage bias. Since all of these texts were written under the patronage of one ruler or the other, are they going to give an accurate account of their ruler's achievements and failures? या फिर failures को छुपाने की और achievements को magnify करने की कोशिश करेंगे? छुपाने की और magnify करने की कोशिश करेंगे, ठीक है? That is one limitation. Secondly, many of the strengths that we had identified, they also appear to be weak. उसमें भी कुछ holes हैं. For example, people such as Barni have paid very little attention to things such as dates and places. तो वो जो chronology उन्होंने establish करी है, that is also not completely reliable. So there are glaring gaps in chronology. Thirdly, while the Tawarikh tradition represented a systematic scientific system of history writing, it could never completely remove itself from its Islamic heritage. And in a country where the bulk of the population was non-Muslim, ये किस तरह का एटीट्यूड लेकर के चलेंगे? रिलीजियस बायस का या फिर रिलीजियस प्लूरलिज्म का? नहीं, बायस का. They are always going to have an inherently biased attitude towards non-Muslims. Fourthly, while describing both events that took place within their lifetimes and during the lifetimes of previous rulers, हमें कई सारी inconsistencies दिखती हैं. So while we had argued that they are very reliable primary and secondary sources, that also does not bear out to be true in all cases. ठीक है? And these are the important limitations of Tawarikh literature. On the whole, क्या बोला जा सकता है about the significance of Tawarikh literature as a source of history? That it cannot be denied that they are extremely valuable, especially in comparison to the existing tradition of Indian literature for the purpose of reconstructing Indian history. But at the same time, historians should not interpret them with an uncritical mind. इनका भी critical analysis जरूरी है. So historians should focus upon their critical appraisal. They should not be accepted at face value. And once more, historians should not rely upon any single source. Rather, they should rely upon all available sources. To reconstruct history through a process of comparison and corroboration. ठीक है, तो अगर किसी एक पीरियड के लिए there are 2 or more texts, then all of them should be considered at the same time. If all of them report the same event in the same manner, only then should it be considered to be completely valid. But जहां पे inconsistencies हैं, वहां पे they should also be taken into mind. The historians must also account for the author's biases, be it his political bias, regional bias, linguistic bias, or his religious bias. ठीक है, only then could the real value of Tawarikh literature as a source of history be truly realized. Okay, तो एक क्वेश्चन लिख लो. Discuss the factors behind the emergence of Tawarikh literature. Full stop. Critically evaluate Tawarikh literature as a source of history. $15 marks, 200 words. क्वेश्चन समझ में आया है ना? ब्रीफली एक आंसर लिख लो इसका. राइट डाउन. Tawarikh literature was introduced in India with the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. Full stop. It encompasses a class of Persian historical chronicles written by court historians covering various phases of the Sultanate period. Full stop. Main point लिखो. Tawarikh literature has the following features. Number 1, they are systematic chronological records in which all important political events and administrative policies are analyzed deeply by professional court historians under royal patronage. Number 2, they are often written in the Persian language. And fall into the category of primary sources while describing contemporary developments. Number 3, at the same time, they also serve as valuable secondary sources for bygone periods. Number 4, this genre of literature, genre, G-E-N-E-R-E, genre का मतलब होता है कैटेगरी, क्लास ऑफ लिटरेचर. This genre of literature is a continuation of the Islamic tradition of Central and Western Asia. अगला मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Some next main point. 5 नहीं, main point. Some important Tawarikh texts include, अब इनके नाम लिख सकते हो, किताबुल हिंद बाय अल-बिरूनी, तबाकत नसीरी बाय सिराज, तारीख फिरोज शाही बाय बर्नी, तारीख फिरोज शाही बाय अफीफ एंड तारीख मुबारक शाही बाय सरहिंदी. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखिए. ठीक. नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट, तवारीख लिटरेचर was shaped by a combination of several factors over a long period of time. Over a long period of time. Full stop. These include, and then sub point में 1, 2, 3, 4 करते हैं. Number 1, Islam encouraged the temperament of narrating important events that shape the polity, society, economy, and intellectual tradition of the age. Number 2, within Islam, recording the deeds and achievements of the Prophet and Caliphs was considered to be an act of religious merit. Number 3, with the growth of the caliphate, it emerged as a prosperous cultural power determined to enrich the Islamic heritage. Full stop. Thus, all academic pursuits, including history writing, were heavily patronized. ठीक है. Number 4, with the establishment or with the emergence of the office of Sultan, Tawarikh writing became an instrument of state policy and royal propaganda. State policy and royal propaganda. Mahmud of full stop. इसी में. Mahmud of Ghazni was the first Turkish Sultan to commission prominent scholars to glorify him through eulogies, resulting in the creation of Firdausi's Shahnama, and Al-Baruni's Kitabul Hind. ठीक है. Next, right, number 5. Later, the Sultans of Delhi inherited the well-established Tariq tradition based on the tone and template. Later, the Sultans of Delhi inherited a well-established Tariq tradition based on the tone and template set by Firdausi's Shahnama. Full stop. इसमें नंबर 5 में एक सब पॉइंट लिखो. Gradually, the promotion of academic pursuits was being considered as an essential duty of the Sultan. Full stop. In the same subpoint. This naturally benefited history writing. Next subpoint. The Sultans also wanted to use history as a political tool, not only to legitimize themselves, but to ensure dynastic succession. Not only to legitimize themselves, but also to ensure dynastic succession. Next subpoint लिखो. The growth of the Tawariq tradition was also aided by the large scale influx of foreign scholars to India due to the Mongol invasions of Central and Western Asia. ठीक है, सब हेडिंग दो. हाँ, सब हेडिंग. Critical evaluation of Tawariq literature as a source of history. Write down. Tawariq literature enjoys a distinct advantage over the existing tradition of Indian literature when it comes to the reconstruction of history. This is due to the following strengths. Number 1, there is no dilution of historical fact with mythology. And emphasis on factual accuracy remains strong. Number 2, the chronology of events in Tawariq literature is generally well documented. In contrast to indigenous literature. Number 3, unlike earlier Indian texts, the authorship of Tawariq literature is well documented, making them more reliable. Number 4. While the bulk of earlier Indian literature was written for religious purposes, comma, Tawarikh literature represents pure history, represents pure history. Represents pure history. Number 5. While historical references in the pre-Tawarikh literature was tangential and accidental, comma, Tawarikh texts place a great degree of importance on the scientific analysis of all important developments and changes. Next, right, number 6. While the earlier Indian scholars sought to create an aura of mystique, around their writings, comma, the purpose of Tawarikh literature was to present history with full transparency and clarity. क्या लिखा आपने? The purpose of Tawarikh literature was to while the earlier Indian scholars sought to create an aura of mystique around their writings, the purpose of Tawarikh literature was to recreate history with full transparency and clarity. ठीक है? Next point, main point. At the same time, comma, Tawarikh texts are not beyond reproach. They are susceptible to the following limitations. Number 1, since these texts were generally commissioned by royal patrons, comma, they present a distorted version of political history. Full stop. The authors tried to appease their patrons by magnifying their achievements and hiding their failures. ठीक है. Number 2, the Tawarikh literature also often suffers from gaps in chronology and historical inconsistencies. Two examples you can write. Example लिखो सब point करके. Example, Ziauddin Barni is often very careless with dates and the proper sequence of events. Next subpoint. Next example. Similarly, Ibn Batuta, Barni and Isami comma, all contemporaries of Muhammad bin Tughlaq have given differing accounts of the same events during his reign. ठीक है. So while they are talking about the same event, हर कोई अलग अलग चीज बोल रहा है. Example, all of them have said different things about the taxation policy introduced by Muhammad bin Tughlaq. All of them have said different things about the token currency experiment introduced by Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Transfer of capital के बारे में अलग अलग चीजें बोली हैं इन्होंने. ठीक है. तो none of them can be completely relied on. पता नहीं कौन सच बोल रहा है, कौन झूठ बोल रहा है. Next point, write down number 3. Tawarikh literature could never fully emerge as a secular field of study, and remained rooted in its Islamic past. Full stop. This is evident from the obvious religious bias that many historians have against non-Muslims and tolerant rulers. Against non-Muslims and religiously tolerant rulers. किसकी बात कर रहे हैं हम? Which author? Barni. Biased against Hindus as well as Muhammad bin Tughlaq. ठीक है? That is one reason why he was so much in favor of Firoz Shah Tughlaq also. Clear? These are some of the limitations. Conclusion लिखो. Write down. On the basis of this analysis, it becomes clear that while Tawarikh literature remains extremely valuable, it should not be accepted at face value. It should not be accepted at face value. Full stop. Historians must evaluate Tawarikh literature in a critical manner. And wherever possible, authenticate it by comparing it against all available sources. Full stop. At the same time, historians should account for the author's inherent as well as explicit bias. Inherent as well as explicit bias. Full stop. In this way, the historical utility of Tawarikh literature may be maximized. May be maximized. ठीक है, तो ये हो गया तवारीख लिटरेचर एज अ होल. नाउ द असेसमेंट ऑफ सम इंडिविजुअल हिस्टोरियंस. हम बात करने वाले हैं 3 हिस्टोरियंस की. बर्नी, आमिर खुसरो एंड इब्न बतूता. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल बर्नी. ठीक है, तो गिव द हेडिंग बर्नी एज अ हिस्टोरियन. किस डायनेस्टी के अंदर ये था? विच पीरियड ऑफ द दिल्ली सल्तनत? तुगलक डायनेस्टी. ठीक है, अल बिरूनी गजनी के टाइम पे था. वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट जियाउद्दीन बर्नी. ठीक है, 14th सेंचुरी, तुगलक डायनेस्टी. इंपॉर्टेंट वर्क्स: तारीख फिरोज शाही, एंड फतवाए जहानदारी. राइट. सब्जेक्ट मैटर ऑफ फतवाए जहानदारी: statecraft. Right, in which Ziauddin Barni has given his own political theory and ideology. In his mind, what should be the ideals by which the state should govern? So, is this a normative text or a factual text? Normative text है, वो norms बता रहा है that these are the ideals that should be followed. And this makes the Fatwa-e-Jahandari unique in the company of contemporary Persian literature. बाकी जितना भी Persian literature था, that was based on factual dealings, material. This was more philosophical. On the other hand, Tarikh-e-Firuz Shahi was a purely historical text. It is considered to be the sequel of Siraj's Tabaqat-e-Nasiri. while the Tabaqat-e-Nasiri covered the history of Islamic rule and Islamic invasions of India right from the earliest periods, right from the establishment of Islam up to the period of Nasiruddin Mahmud, जो कि बलबन के पहले वाला रूलर था. He was also Balban's son-in-law. The Tariq-e-Firuz Shahi covers the history of the Sultanate from Balban to the first 6 years of Firoz Shah Tughlaq's reign. ठीक है? And it is here that the Tariq-e-Firuz Shahi represented a new beginning. How was it different from the existing tradition of Indian historiography or Turkish historiography in India? क्या डिफरेंट था इसमें? इसके पहले वाले हिस्टोरियंस हमेशा इंडिया की हिस्ट्री को कहां से शुरू करते थे? विद द एडवेंट ऑफ इस्लाम, एंड दे यूज्ड टू फोकस, दे यूज्ड टू लिंक द इंडियन हिस्ट्री विद सेंट्रल एशियन एंड वेस्ट एशियन हिस्ट्री, राइट? इसने क्या किया? He treated Indian history as a completely separate domain. Thus, he de-linked Indian history from Western or from Central and Western Asian history the first time. Okay. Now, the Tawarikh-e-Firuz Shahi is extremely valuable because it covers the period of the Sultanate's maturity, a period in which many of the most interesting historical personalities of the Sultanate existed, such as Balban, Alauddin Khilji, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Firoz Shah Tughlaq, etc. And it gives us a deep insight into how the minds of the rulers worked. It gives us the theories of kingship of various rulers such as Balban, Alauddin Khilji, Muhammad bin Tughlaq and Firoz Shah Tughlaq. This work is also extremely analytical, right? Thus, it becomes an extremely important source of history. Clear hai? At the same time, it suffers from some important limitations. क्या लिमिटेशन है इसके? Number 1, he was writing in order to appease Firoz Shah Tughlaq. Right? And because of this, he was overtly critical against his predecessor Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Thirdly, he also exhibited a great sense of pride in his identity as a Muslim and in his identity as a Turkish noble. So he also had a deep religious and ethnic bias. Often he criticized Muhammad bin Tughlaq for elevating low-born men who did not have the right blood in their veins because they did not belong to the nobility. So he also suffered from an explicit class bias. And fifthly, even his philosophical model for kingship created in the Fatwa Jahandari, where he introduced the concept of the ideal Muslim king, this was once again extremely steeped in religion. Okay? So he lacked objectivity in secular matters and viewed them through the lens of religion. Okay? So these are the limitations. Critical evaluation, क्या बोल सकते हो एंड में कंक्लूजन में? Barni's writings are extremely valuable but not entirely reliable, must be taken with a grain of salt. ठीक है? His biases must be accounted for if the real significance of Barni as a historian needs to be appreciated. And finally, अच्छा limitations में ना एक gap और था, that he is very careless about chronology. And conclusion में finally we can also say that along with critical evaluation, comparison and corroboration against alternate texts must be done. Okay? ये हो गया बर्नी एज अ हिस्टोरियन. बताओ इसको लिखवाने की जरूरत है या फिर आगे बढ़ सकते हैं? हाँ, नहीं, इसको लिखवाने की जरूरत है, डिक्टेट करने की जरूरत है या फिर सफिशिएंट है? ठीक है. हाँ, नेक्स्ट. Analyze the significance of Barni as a historian और evaluate Barni as a historian. इस तरह से क्वेश्चन आ सकता है. ठीक है. Second, Amir Khusro as a historian. Who was Amir Khusro? An important literary and cultural personality. Who was a pioneer in the fields of literature, poetry, and music, and thus, unlike other historians, was he a professional historian or a professional artist? He was not a professional historian. But he was commissioned by various sultans. He served as many as 6 sultans from the Ilbari period right up to the Tughlaq period. He was commissioned by various sultans to record important events and their achievements. Okay. Now, he did not write Tawarikh literature. Tawarikh literature characterized by what kind of style? A dry, academic, and analytical style. यहाँ पे आर्टिस्टिक एक्सप्रेशन पोएट्री के ऊपर फोकस होगा या फिर फैक्चुअल इंफॉर्मेशन के ऊपर फोकस होगा? फैक्चुअल इंफॉर्मेशन के ऊपर फोकस होगा. सो इट वाज नॉट stylized. In contrast, Amir Khusro was a cultural personality and he pioneered several new genres of literature, including divans, masnavis, and khamsas. Divans क्या होते हैं? Short poems consisting of rhyming couplets. Masnavis are long poems or epics consisting of rhyming couplets, and they are generally, theme क्या होता है इनका? The deeds and achievements of important personalities. So they represent a historical record. और खमसा क्या होता है? A collection of five masnavis. ठीक है, तो अलग अलग जॉनर्स ऑफ पोएट्री तो इसने इजाद किए, लेकिन हिस्ट्री राइटिंग के पर्सपेक्टिव से कौन सा सिग्निफिकेंट है? मसनवी एंड खमसा. Now, he authored several masnavis such as the Kiran-us-Sadain, the Miftah-ul-Futuh, the Khazain-ul-Futuh, the Tughlaqnama, the Nusifir, etc. Kiran-us-Sadain literally meaning the meeting of the two stars, records an actual meeting which took place between Sultan Kaykubat of Delhi and his father, the Sultan of Bengal, Bughra Khan. एंड राइटिंग स्टाइल क्या होगा? पोएटिक और प्लेन? पोएटिक स्टाइल में होगा, मसनवी लिखा हुआ है. मिफ्ताहुल फुतूह literally meaning the secrets of victory is a poetic masnavi written about the achievements of Jalaluddin Khilji. Khazain-ul-Futuh or Treasures of Victory covers the military achievements of Alauddin Khilji. Tughlaqnama is a poetic account of the achievements of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq. While the Nusifir, meaning the ninth cloud, is more of a non, or we can say it was written under royal patronage during the reign of Ghiyasuddin Tughlaq only, but it focuses more upon contemporary life. Right? It heavily praises Delhi, India, and Indians. Amir Khusro compares India, its people, its language, its culture, its cuisine to the कंडीशंस ऑफ सेंट्रल एंड वेस्ट एशिया। एंड क्या बोलता है ये, कौन ज्यादा सुपीरियर है? इंडिया की कंडीशन ज्यादा सुपीरियर है, ठीक है। सो ही कंपोज्ड अ लार्ज नंबर ऑफ इंपॉर्टेंट हिस्टोरिकल वर्क्स। अब टाइम पीरियड ही ऐसा था दैट ही स्टार्टेड राइटिंग फ्रॉम द 1280s एंड कंटिन्यूड राइटिंग टिल द 1320s। इस पीरियड में खिलबरी डायनेस्टी खत्म हो रहा था, खिलजी डायनेस्टी का पूरा पीरियड निकल गया और तुगलक डायनेस्टी का इनिशियल पीरियड गया, ठीक है। सो किसी एक डायनेस्टी के साथ एसोसिएटेड नहीं है। सबसे पहले एलबरी, फिर खिलजी, फिर तुगलक। नाउ what makes his writings extremely valuable? Strengths क्या हैं इनकी राइटिंग की? First of all, a new and a refreshing style of writing, ठीक है। Secondly, the greater degree of attention given to non-political history. Number 3, in comparison to official court historians such as Ziauddin Barni, Amir Khusro, being a cultural person, was much more careful and accurate about dates and places. So his factual accuracy is much greater in comparison to other contemporary Tawarikh literature. Amir Khusro was at the intersection of not only the court, but he was also associated with the Sufi tradition. Chishti silsila ke follower the. He was a close follower of Nizamuddin Auliya. He also was connected with the cultural and literary life of Delhi during the 14th century. Therefore, his writings offer a much wider view of history. Holistic view of contemporary life due to his association with the court, Sufism and art. ठीक है। एट द सेम टाइम कुछ वीकनेसेस भी हैं। क्या वीकनेसेस? सबसे पहला वीकनेस, that he was writing primarily to do what? Appease his royal patrons. So a distinct patronage bias is visible. Secondly, फोकस किस पे है? हिस्टोरिकल एनालिसिस पे या आर्टिस्टिक एक्सप्रेशन पर? फोकस इज मोर ऑन आर्टिस्टिक एक्सप्रेशन. Artistic expression trumps historical analysis. And thirdly, बिकॉज आर्टिस्टिक एक्सप्रेशन इज द फोकस. एक्सप्रेशन कैसा होगा, हमेशा एक्यूरेट, जिस आंखों देखा हाल है वो बताया जाएगा, या फिर उसमें कुछ वेगनेस होगा, सिमिलीज या फिर कुछ और टूल्स यूज किए जाएंगे, कुछ और टूल्स ये यूज किए जाएंगे. सो समटाइम्स द एक्सप्रेशन इज वेग. So historians have to take a leap of faith while interpreting what exactly Amir Khusro was trying to relate in some cases. ठीक है. कंक्लूजन में हम क्या बोल सकते हैं, that Amir Khusro's writings present a unique insight into Sultanate history. His wide coverage of the careers of several sultans is something that is unprecedented. And the real utility of his work emerges when it is supplemented with other contemporary literature. So real utility emerges when supplemented by contemporary literature. ठीक है, that is the note on which we can conclude. क्लियर है, आमिर खुसरो के कंट्रीब्यूशन समझ में आया है व्हेन इट कम्स टू हिस्ट्री. नेक्स्ट कौन था, इब्न बतूता एज अ हिस्टोरियन. कौन था ये इब्न बतूता? He was born and brought up in Morocco. He is remembered as one of the greatest explorers and travelers of the Islamic world during the medieval age. So he was a Moroccan traveler. With extensive travels across Africa. He traveled not only across the whole of North Africa, but also traveled to Western Africa. सहारा क्रॉस करके साहेल रीजन में पहुंच गया था. राइट. He also went to Egypt. He also traveled to the Levant and even went to Europe, visiting Greece. And Macedonia through Constantinople. He came to India via Iran, Sindh and Balochistan. North India, Hindustan, the Deccan region, the Maldives, Sri Lanka, Java, and finally China before he returned to Morocco. ठीक है, तो वेस्ट एशिया ये मोरक्को जाने के जो वापस गया उसके बाद इसको भेजा गया था. हिज रूलर हैड आस्क्ड हिम टू ट्रैवल टू वेस्ट अफ्रीका. तो पहले लेग में इसने ये नॉर्थ अफ्रीका, एशिया एंड चाइना कवर किया, और सेकेंड लेग ऑफ हिज जर्नी इन हिज ओल्ड एज ही वेंट टू वेस्ट अफ्रीका. ठीक है. He was a contemporary of which Sultan of Delhi? किसके रूल में आया था ये इंडिया? मोहम्मद बिन तुगलक. ठीक है. Upon arriving in India, did he have any direct contact with Muhammad bin Tughlaq? Yes. He was welcomed and favored, given favor, shown favor by Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who appointed him as the Qazi of Delhi. When he was about to leave Delhi, he was appointed as Muhammad bin Tughlaq's official ambassador to China. On his way to China, before he reached China, he traveled extensively across India. Traveled extensively across India. And has written about a large variety of subjects such as political events, policies and experiments of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the personality of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, the or small biographies of several important personalities at the court In his extensive travels across India, he also came across the common people at a much more personal level. Common life, Indian culture, climate, vegetation, agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade have been described by him in some detail. He has also provided a comparative analysis of life in India as compared to other places, including China and the Arab world. Okay? And herein lies his greatest strength. Clear? However, his writings suffer from some serious limitations as well. First of all, ये जो इसकी किताब है known as the किताब उल रिहला, in Arabic, it was not written as the developments were taking place. ये इसने कब लिखा? In his old age, when he had already returned to Morocco and settled there permanently. He was more than 60 years of age at that point of time, right? So, written in his old age, when his memory was fading. Secondly, it was not even written in his own hand. He had dictated it, but it was based upon dictations to a scribe. किसी और को ये डिक्टेट कर रहा था, वो सुन रहा था, एंड फ्रॉम हिज मेमोरी ही वाज रिक्रिएटिंग इट, फेयर कर रहा था उसको. Secondly, the author also seems to be biased against Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who had punished him for some transgressions. तो कुछ फ्रॉड वगैरह का केस इसके ऊपर लग गया था इब्न बतूता के ऊपर, एंड मोहम्मद बिन तुगलक being Muhammad bin Tughlaq had imprisoned him for some time before he was released. ठीक है? So he also displayed some bias against Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Thirdly, Ibn Battuta, being a foreign traveler, was susceptible to the general limitations, general weaknesses of a foreigner's accounts. किस तरह के जनरल लिमिटेशन सफर करते हैं फॉरेनर्स अकाउंट्स? बताओ, एंशिएंट हिस्ट्री में हमने कवर किया था. तो लैंग्वेज बैरियर को ओवरकम करना जरूरी होता है. Secondly, they view the contemporary situation in India through their own cultural lenses, leading to some miscalculations, misinterpretations. So, interpretation of Indian conditions through foreign cultural lens, leading to misinterpretations. Thirdly, what were the circles that Ibn Battuta was accustomed to moving in? Was he a member of the elite class or the common classes? Elite member tha na, he was made the Qazi of Delhi, royal patronage by the Sultan himself. So, it is reasonable to assume that a distinct class bias had also seeped into his writings. He may not have been able to appreciate the conditions of the common people accurately, which is apparent from his writings as well. So, there were inaccuracies in his description of common life. And fourthly, since his audience was not Indian, he wanted to generate interest in the foreign audience about India and its rulers. Therefore, his account was also heavily sensationalized. Reducing the credibility of his writings. Conclusion में क्या लिखोगे? Despite these shortcomings, the Kitabul Rihla remains extremely valuable, especially if contrasted against other contemporary works Ibn Battuta's proximity to the Sultan and the court as a foreigner put him in a unique position. क्या यूनिक पोजीशन? While he was in a position to observe directly the goings on at the court, he interacted directly with the Sultan. He did not face the same pressures that other Indian historians did when writing the official chronicles. तो वहां पे जो जो रॉयल पेट्रनेज वाला बायस है वो उतना स्ट्रांग नहीं था उसकी राइटिंग्स में. So he was in a position to directly observe the personality of the Sultan, his temperament, his policy, and the structure of his court, the important nobles, their aspirations. He was relatively free of patronage bias. And this makes Ibn Battuta singular among all the other contemporary historians. तो या तो वो सुल्तान के पास नहीं पहुंच पाते थे अगर इंडिपेंडेंटली लिखते थे, या फिर अगर सुल्तान के पास होते थे तो इंडिपेंडेंट राइटिंग नहीं कर पाते थे, राइट. एंड thus the Kitabul Rihla remains extremely important for the reconstruction of history. लेकिन limitations को overcome करने के लिए it needs to be compared and contrasted against other contemporary works. That is the note on which we will conclude. ठीक है, take down a couple of questions, 3 questions. Evaluate the contributions of Ziauddin Barni as a historian. अगला question, evaluate the contributions of Amir Khusro as a historian. तीसरा question, evaluate the contributions of Ibn Battuta as a historian. (15 marks). (200 words). ठीक है. So with that we have covered the history of the Delhi Sultanate. अगला टॉपिक हमें कवर करना है the Vijayanagar and Bahmani kingdom. That we are going to do in tomorrow's class. I am ending the class already. Architecture of this Delhi Sultanate. Limitations of centralization under लोधी, तो ये कवर कर लेते हैं आज. limitations of centralization under the Lodi dynasty. Time period of the Lodi dynasty. (1457 to 1526). How many rulers? 3 rulers. Bahlol Lodi, Sikandar Lodi, and Ibrahim Lodi. What were the circumstances for their rise to power? The weakness of the Sayyid dynasty was capitalized upon Bahlol Lodi, who was serving as the governor of Punjab. The internal administration of the Sayyids was crumbling, their military administration was in disarray, and the provincial units were often in open rebellion. Bahlol Lodi saw this as a great opportunity and he took the support of his ethnic brethren. Okay? The Lodis were an Afghan group and Bahlol Lodi was assisted by the Afghan nobility in overthrowing the last Sayyid ruler. Last Sayyid ruler, his name was Alauddin Alam Shah. So, इसके against rebellion हुआ and he was so weak that he did not even put up a fight. He abdicated in favor of Bahlol Lodi. With this, Bahlol Lodi became the new Sultan. And as he became the new Sultan, he introduced a new model of kingship based on the Afghan theory of kingship, which is distinct from the Turkish model of kingship, जो कि हम मोहम्मद बिन तुगलक अलाउद्दीन के अंदर देखते हैं. Under the Afghan theory of kingship, the Sultan is not considered to be the supreme ruler. He is not considered to be a despotic ruler. Rather, he is simply considered to be the first among equals. ठीक है? ऐसा क्यों है that सुल्तान को फर्स्ट अमंग इक्वल्स कंसिडर किया जाता था, not as the supreme ruler? Because of the history of the Afghan region. The Afghan society was never unified. It was divided along regional and tribal lines. Since it was divided into several tribes, unity at a larger scale would be possible only by unifying the tribes. उसके दो तरीके हो सकते हैं. You defeat all the leaders of individual tribes, force them to accept your rule, या फिर उनके साथ समझौता कर लो. जनरल पैटर्न क्या था इस्लामिक अफगान पीरियड में? दैट यूनिफिकेशन टुक प्लेस एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ कंसेंसस. ठीक है, सो कंसेंसस बिल्डिंग had emerged as the most important tool for unification. ठीक है, एंड दूसरा reason why Bahlol Lodi introduced the Afghan theory of kingship and not the Turkish theory of kingship was because of the way in which he had gathered power. कैसे उसने अपना ताज लिया था? With the assistance of the Afghan nobility. Since he had come to power with the Afghan nobility, he needed to reward the Afghan nobility to ensure their continued support and goodwill. तो अब बताओ, will the Afghan model of kingship become the basis for a highly centralized form of government or a highly decentralized form of government? Highly decentralized form of government. Decentralization and feudalism under Bahlol Lodi कहां दिखता है? इसके पहले जितने भी राजा होते, जितने भी सुल्तान होते थे, all of them had a proper throne in their throne room. There was a strict distinction between the sultan and the other nobility. ठीक है, however Bahlol Lodi never even sat on a throne. कहां पे बैठता था ये? He sat, talked and ate in the company of his senior nobles on the same carpet, एक ही दरी के ऊपर, in order to show that he was not above the other nobles, he was their equal. Sat with his nobles on the same dari, on the same carpet. Secondly, the Ikta system was modified. Iktas were distributed among the important Afghan nobles and made hereditary. Thirdly, in the central government, elements of feudalization became visible, with some important positions being assigned to important noble houses as their hereditary keep. Okay, so some central government offices also became hereditary. Thirdly, revenue administration was also completely decentralized. The demand for fawazil was abolished. The center stopped asking the provinces to pay revenue to them. Okay? To send revenue to them. फोर्थली, क्या क्या हमने देखा अभी, हाँ, थ्रोन नहीं था, इक्ता सिस्टम हेरिडेटरी हो गया, सेंट्रल गवर्नमेंट हेरिडेटरी हो गया, फवाजिल को अबॉलिश कर दिया गया. नेक्स्ट राइट, the tradition of making cash salaries to soldiers was also abolished. The system of survey and measurement was also abolished. Bahlol Lodi never tried to maintain a degree of separation between the crown and the nobility. Rather, he used to personally visit the important nobles. In fact, he used to ride on horses that were only and only gifted by his nobles in order to show them favor. So, tried to remain in the nobility's good graces at all times. बट यहाँ पे सबसे बड़ा डेंजर क्या था? That the nobility would become so strong that it would try to replace the Sultan himself, challenge the rule of his successors. So, the decentralization and increasing feudalization made the Sultanate susceptible to internal rebellion. And therefore, despite his lenient attitude towards the Afghan nobility, Bahlol Lodi did not hesitate to punish rebels regardless of their background, regardless of whether they were Afghans or non-Afghans. In fact, due to rebellions in Punjab and Gujarat, he also executed the governors of Punjab and Gujarat. At the same time, he also ensured dynastic succession. He made sure that the succession of his son Sikandar Lodi would not be contested even after his death. ठीक है? So, although feudalism and decentralization were extremely high under Bahlol Lodi, there were some elements of centralization that were still visible. Sikandar Lodi was cut from a different cloth as compared to his father. He tried to incorporate the Turkish model of kingship in his administration and policies. So, by saying the Turkish model, इसकी बात कर रहे हैं हम centralization और decentralization. Turkish model centralization. ठीक है? तो क्या क्या करने की कोशिश करी इसने? First of all, he revived the system of survey and measurement. And with this, he began interfering directly in the revenue machinery at the lowest levels of administration. He started insisting upon the calculation, collection and remission of fawazil from the various iqtadars. तो fawazil का जो concept था उसको इसने revive कर दिया. He made attempts to strengthen his military so as to establish military superiority not only over external enemies but also against possible internal opponents, his other feudatories. In central administration, hereditary offices were abolished. And all appointments were made under the hand and seal of the king personally by him. By this point of time, Sikandar Lodi was finding it more and more difficult to contain the ambitious nobles at Delhi. Therefore, he removed himself from Delhi. Delhi से अपना कोर्ट इसने शिफ्ट कर दिया. He constructed the city of आगरा for this purpose. ठीक है, तो आगरा में इसने अपना नया कैपिटल बनाया. Now, although his reforms were successful in reducing the level of decentralization, they were not completely successful. Is the Afghan nobility going to welcome these changes or will it resist these changes? Resist करेंगे तो उनका तो नुकसान हो रहा है. There was constant resistance. And it was in this scenario that Ibrahim Lodi acceded to the throne. He inherited both the zeal to centralize administration from his father's period and at the same time the continuous resistance against administrative centralization. Now, while Sikandar Lodi had a great degree of experience in managing these things, Ibrahim Lodi lacked this experience, right? Therefore, पलड़ा किसका भारी हुआ? इसका या इसका? इसका, resistance का. And this led to the fractures within the Sultanate becoming wider. Fractures within the Sultanate widened. And what was the result of this? The enemies of the Sultanate capitalized upon this. Initially, Rana Sanga, and later Babur capitalized upon the internal fractures of the Delhi Sultanate. सबसे पहले राजस्थान और गुजरात वाला रीजन राणा सांगा के कंट्रोल में आया. Then the adversaries of Ibrahim Lodi invited Babur to attack Delhi. Okay? This led to the downfall of the Lodi dynasty. and it is because of the awareness of this reason, these factors, जब सेकंड अफगान एम्पायर इंडिया में एस्टैब्लिश हुआ, अंडर विच डायनेस्टी, अंडर विच रूलर? लोधीज के बाद अगले अफगान रूलर्स कौन हुए इंडिया के? नॉट बाबर, वो तो मुगल हो गए। अफगान रूलर्स सूरीज, राइट? यस, शेर शाह सूरी ने अफगान मॉडल लगाया या नहीं लगाया? नहीं लगाया। He focused upon excessive centralization from the beginning, ठीक है? So these are the limitations of centralization under Afghan rule, under the Lodi dynasty. Take down a question. हाँ, नोट्स में मैं दे दूंगा, नोट्स में लिखा होगा। Highlight the limitations of the limitations of centralization under the Afghan model of kingship. Full stop. Under the Afghan model of kingship. Full stop. How was it responsible for the downfall of the Delhi Sultanate? How was it responsible for the downfall of the Delhi Sultanate? Question mark. ठीक है? So that is it. Right? So that is it for today. आज जो हमने कवर किया है दो टॉपिक्स, एक तो हिस्टोरियोग्राफी, अच्छा तीन टॉपिक्स, असेसमेंट ऑफ बर्नी, इब्न बतूता एंड आमिर खुसरो एज हिस्टोरियंस, एंड ये लिमिटेशंस ऑफ सेंट्रलाइजेशन ड्यूरिंग अफगान रूल। कोई डाउट्स हैं इसमें?